What are some of the most obvious or glaring parallels between Hitler's takeover and our own times? And I'm not even going to mention any names, but when you were describing Hitler's rise to power, some images, some parallels offered themselves immediately, like Hitler being impervious to telling lies, not acknowledging that he lost an election, bullying of political opponents, and so forth. Could you break these down, these parallels, a little bit further?
Well, Donald Trump, I think that's where you're going. Donald Trump never said heads will roll. What he said was bring out the guillotine.
More like French Revolution style.
Did the same thing, yeah. When heads did roll, so the point is. But let me actually start with the biggest difference, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
The biggest difference between Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump were in the polling numbers. Donald Trump is polling numbers that Adolf Hitler never could have dreamed of having. Right around 50%, whether it's 48% or 51%, depending on the poll that you're looking at. Hitler never did better than 37%. Well, actually, yeah, in a free and open election, Adolf Hitler never did better than 37%. He never had, among the German people, the current level of support that Donald Trump has among the American electorate. And that, to my mind, is, there are, lots of unsettling parallels, but to my mind, that is one of the most striking when you're looking at a comparison student, because you really have to think about it, that, here we see Hitler as this, the German people en masse behind him, and yet never able to poll higher than 37%. And, as I say, could never even have dreamed of the numbers that Trump has at this point. The similarities, there are a lot of facile ones. Hitler was telling, when he was telling his followers to show up for the November 32 election, quote unquote, from Donald Trump, which was, he says, be there, it's going to be wild. There is as you mentioned, the belittling of political opponents, this Teflon ability to deflect every kind of criticism, frankly, this resilience to being mocked and humiliated, repeatedly, is same. But I think that probably the clearest similarity to my mind is this self-imposed blindness to anything that would resemble defeat. And, including losing an election and going to court to have the election results overthrown. But this blindness to anything that doesn't fit sort of his particular vision of where things are. And, it is, Hitler was a man who remarkably was able to take events and shape them to his will. This triumph of this notion of this Nietzschean notion of the Superman, really did apply to Hitler. And, there could have been a number of people along the way who maybe could have filled some kind of role, but didn't have the luck, and for one reason or another fell by the wayside, and Hitler just lucked there. Though I cannot think of a single German politician who came even close to Hitler in terms of what you'd call charisma. And it's a bit like, I think, when you look at the American political landscape, I don't see anyone out there that has this type of character and this nature. What I would say about this current situation is one of my favorite quotes from an old eminent historian, is that the Weimar Republic died twice. It was murdered and it committed suicide. We know who the perpetrator of the murder was. That's very clear. But the fact was, for an act of state suicide is much more complicated, especially when it involves a constitutional republic with all the protections of freedom of speech, public referendum, due process. And you have, in some ways, I think that can apply to the United States. Donald Trump has, called himself said that he would be dictator on day one. And I'm not saying that American democracy will be dissembled, but I think it is, when you take Trump at his word, one should find some of this worrying. When you talk about vengeance on political opponents, when you look at this fomenting of hatred against different groups of people, whether they're immigrants or whatever. When you look at that accumulatively, one should be unsettled by that. And the fact that you have 51% of Americans, hearing this and are willing to accept it. I think this old notion of dying twice does apply in this case. Do I think that America will collapse into a dictatorship? No. But I think the guardrails of our democratic system are being tested to the extreme. But also, this maybe you talked earlier when we began about the structures of what were there structural flaws in the Weimar Republic, in the Weimar Constitution. There may be fundamental flaws in what we call a democracy. Does it require people being willing to play by the rules? Hitler's avowed goal to destroy democracy through democratic process, which he did. The one piece here, maybe this to close this up, is that the one thing that did survive the entire Nazi period was the Weimar Constitution. Hitler, it was never revoked. The Weimar Constitution remained in place as the legal basis for the government all the way until the end of the war. And then only after the war did they come up with what was called the Grundgesetz, this founding law. But that then suspended the Weimar Republic, which means that everything that happened in Nazi Germany, there were various emergency decrees and special this enabling act and all of that, but the Constitution itself remained intact through that entire period. I do believe that the American Constitution will remain intact. But one can worry about how it's interpreted, how it's used, how it's misused, how it's abused.
Okay, very last question. If I may offer just an important distinction between Trump and Hitler, maybe that Trump just seems like an obscene con man, more of that kind of type, who believes in nothing really and will basically say anything he needs to propel himself forward. Basically an opportunist, and not a very bright one at that. I doubt that Donald Trump reads books, much less one a day. Hitler, on the other hand, actually had a vision, an extremely terrifying one at that, but it was there because he detailed it in his book long before he came to power, or shortly before he came to power. Would you agree that there is this kind of crucial difference between the two?
Yeah, I think, yes. And I think that with Donald Trump, he's a businessman and everything is transactional. And I think that's the word that he uses, that he is completely open about it. Hitler was a dark visionary, you might say, but what really did surprise me, even when the party was in its deepest crisis, this was in December of 32, when they'd lost their votes, when they were bankrupt, when they were hemorrhaging, votes and members, Hitler was not going to move from his particular vision for Germany. I guess both men have written books, and maybe it reflected, I think Hitler, wrote Mein Kampf, in which he kind of laid out everything that you needed to know about Hitler and what was to happen. It can be found in the pages of Mein Kampf. And I think, if you're looking for the parallel or the bookend one to that, I think, Trump's Art of the Deal is, it is transactional, and
But I heard he didn't even write that. I heard that he had a ghostwriter.
Yeah, well, he did, I guess. Yeah,
Oh,
he
okay,
did.
yeah.
Well, that's as well. Well, I mean, though there are those claims also about Adolf Hitler,
Oh,
because
I didn't know.
one of his aides was. Well, the question was, actually it was Hitler dictating it, but one Rudolf Hess, hammering this out on a typewriter. How much was edited or not? But yeah.
Very, very quickly, the very last question, I promise. Our era is maybe a bit different in that we're facing many existential global challenges today, like from growing wealth inequality, climate breakdown, AI, and so forth. As somebody studying one of the worst times in human history, do you think these sort of collective challenges are more likely to bring us all together or to produce another Hitler or many local Hitlers?
My main concern when you look for parallels or similarities is that it's no secret Trump's affection for Putin. And I think in a trans or other authoritarian leaders, my concern is that both of these men have very similar personality types, which is also Hitler's personality types, which you never admit defeat. When you're confronted, you double down. They can be these transactional relationships until it reaches a point of confrontation. And what I keep remembering is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where there was a transactional relationship between Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler to invade Poland in 1939. I mean, we keep remembering, and clearly it's the German invasion of Poland from the west into the east, but we forget that the Red Army came into Poland moved west, and that the two men divided up that country. Okay, but what happens 2 years later in spring of 1941? We end up with the greatest land battle in history as these two men confront each other and end up with the absolute cataclysm. And I guess my one concern would be that when you get these, and this is becoming an era of strong authoritarian leaders. We've seen that across. The Germans call it zeitgeist. My one big concern is not only what the domestic implications might be of a second Trump presidency, but also in terms of global affairs. People will find common cause in dealing however they want to deal with a situation like Ukraine, and one can be very fearful of that outcome. But I think in the or the Baltic states for that matter, or whatever, what the implications would be. But I think in the longer term, these two men are too similar in terms of personality and reaction. And there I could imagine an absolute worst case scenario. And as I say, to my mind, the Stalin-Hitler relationship keeps resonating strongly when it comes down to these transactional relationships rather than what we used to call diplomacy.
Hey, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. This podcast has no sponsors, no production team, and no editors. It's just little old me. And as such, I'm at the mercy of you lovely folks watching and listening. So please do subscribe on YouTube. Click that little bell thing. Follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Also, I don't want to sell you an ugly t-shirt that you don't really need. So if you can, and most of all, if you want, please support me on Patreon. And at this point, I have to express my eternal gratitude to my patrons on Patreon, aka the producers of this show. As always, without you comrades, this podcast simply wouldn't exist. So a massive, massive thank you to Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaž, Štrole, Aida, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordon, Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Taichi. You guys are the best.